cammino della vittoria. Comando Supremo, 4 novembre 1918, ore 12. La guerra contro l'Austria-Ungheria, che sotto l'alta guida di Sua Maestà il Re, Duce Supremo, l'esercito italiano, inferiore per numero e per mezzi, iniziò il 24 maggio 1915 e con fede incrollabile e tenace valore condusse ininterrotta ed asprissima per 41 mesi e vinta. La gigantesca battaglia, ingaggiata il 24 dello scorso ottobre e dalla quale prendevano parte 51 divisioni italiane, 3 britanniche, 2 francesi ed una cecoslovacca ed un reggimento americano contro 63 divisioni austro-ungariche, è finita. La fulminea arditissima avanzata del 29° Corpo di Armata su Trento, sbarrando le vie della ritirata alle armate nemiche nel Trentino, travolte ad occidente dalle truppe della 7ª Armata, che ad oriente da quelle della prima, sesta e quarta ha determinato ieri lo sfacelo totale della fronte avversaria. Dal Brenta al Torre, l'irresistibile slancio della 12ª, della 8ª, della 10ª Armata e delle divisioni di cavalleria ricaccia sempre più indietro il nemico fuggente. Nella pianura, Sua Altezza Reale, il Duca d'Aosta, avanza rapidamente alla testa della sua invicta 3ª Armata, anelante di ritornare sulle posizioni da essa già vittoriosamente conquistate che mai aveva perdute. L'esercito austro-ungarico è annientato. Esso ha subito perdite gravissime nell'accanita resistenza dei primi giorni e nell'inseguimento. Ha perdute quantità ingentissime di materiali di ogni sorta e pressoché per intero i suoi magazzini e i depositi. Ha lasciato finora nelle nostre mani circa 300.000 prigionieri con interi stati maggiori e non meno di 5.000 cannoni. I resti di quello che fu uno dei più potenti eserciti del mondo risalgono in disordine e senza speranza le valli che avevano difeso con orgogliosa sicurezza. Il capo di Stato Maggiore dell'esercito, generale Diaz.
All right. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The War Room, where we talk about anything and everything World War II. First and foremost, me and my co-host would like to give a shout out to our subscribers. Thanks for listening in. Thanks for tuning in. We truly appreciate the love and support. Hope you all are doing well on this lovely Saturday night, Sunday morning, wherever you are within the world today. And on this episode, we're going to continue with our background of El Duce, the Iron Prefect, also known as Benito Mussolini. So first and foremost, let me bring up our co-hosts and our lovely Logic's finest, Mr. Paul. How you doing, sir?
How are you, sir?
Oh, not too bad, not too bad. So I wanted to throw in just a little video at the beginning to show what the Italian army was kind of going through when they was in World War One. And the reason why I wanted to show that is because it's actually going to tie in a little bit of the propaganda that Benito was trying to display during the First World War, the Great War, and how that will eventually set up his means of his political development into his eventual dictatorship of Italy.
Give me one quick second.
Yeah, take your time. Take your time. All right. Our co-host is going to make some changes in the background, but we will definitely continue on. And so, like I said, the video that I showed at the beginning is a video that talks a little bit about the Italian army during World War One. And it's going to play a major role in today's episode where we talk a little bit about Benito and his influence in regards to Italy's entry into World War One. All right. So, Paul, if you had a chance to view some of the video at the beginning, what was your take on Italy's portrayal within World War One?
That's a very interesting question that you posed there because um, it seemed to me as if Italy was in a very interesting place, almost as if they were largely portrayed the same way as Germany was after World War One. Um, a somewhat defeated and broken country, thought of not even thought of as a serious contender on the global geopolitical stage, and kind of overlooked. So El Duce Mussolini comes along and he feels he has the answer, fascism. So it's very it for me. I've always been fascinated how the global outlook
Mm.
was going into World War One and then World War Two, and how it's been permanently changed after World War Two.
Yeah, exactly. That's my same sentiments as well. Because when I was first looking at this video before posting it on tonight's episode, it seemed to me that, at least from the audience point of view, it would make it seem like Italy had performed really well within the Great War, as far as the video showing them in combat, the victory speech that was being given as commentary to the images and all. So from an audience standpoint, it really did seem like Italy contributed greatly to the Great War. But in actuality, um, Italy had little, if at all, influence over the war. And in fact, they were one of the ones, excuse me, they were one of the ones that, even though they were the victors or part of the group that won the war, not only did they have the most damage to their economy outside of Germany, but they actually did not gain anything of value even after the war.
Exactly right. So it's of interest how so on this series we've already looked at how devastated Germany's economy was after the war, and how, of course, as nations are wont to do, they were set upon and basically, just ran roughshod over by the victors. And so it took strong leadership to unify the country and then to rebuild the country socially and economically, politically, and of course, militarily. Because you can, but if you're going to be a global player, you could only advance but so far economically unless you're going to be in a position, ironically enough, not done on purpose, but ironically enough, unless you're going to be present day Germany, you're only going to go but so far economically without a strong military as well. So if you look at your current global powers, other than Germany,
Mm-hmm.
they have that. But that's a whole other reason as to why Germany is there. But again, you see how it takes this strong, charismatic leader to lead the charge to rebuild a nation, and this is something that plays out through history. This is not unique to post World War One nations.
Exactly. And you're definitely right about how the influence that a lot of these nations that are struggling, it seems as if World War One, post-war, was pretty much the bedrock of where nationalism started to form and it started to really gain like nationwide foundation within other nations. You can look at Germany's standpoint, and they were the ones that was on the losing end, and the amount of economic damage the war caused them leading up to the post-war, eventually it was going to come back to haunt them, to where they just had to simply go in a new direction. And even later on, we'll talk about how the economic crash of the 1928 stock market that led to the Great Depression, how that was also the fuel that garnered more nationalism across the whole world. So it's something how these bits and pieces of just small details in history may not seem so significant back then, but in today's time, like us who are true World War II historians that go and look back at these significant events, that's when you start to see that just those small little details plays a huge ripple effect into how the world is shaped today.
You know, you know, I absolutely could not agree more with you. And me personally, you know what? I've always been interested of that word nationalism, and that's something that you certainly heard around the world, but
Mm-hmm.
especially in the United States of America, the past 3 years, nationalism and the rise of nationalism and socialism and fascism. And, as a fellow historian and as a fellow military historian, I think we can pretty much agree every country to a degree has nationalism. Um, my personal opinion, the difference is, where is it tempered? How far is it taken? We've seen
Mm.
extreme examples, but every country has nationalism. And if you don't think so, just look what happens every 2 years. Summer
Mm-hmm.
Olympics, Winter Olympics. Winter Olympics every four, winter every four. But Olympics, World Games, sports, all of it. It's nationalism. It's just when
Mm-hmm.
people only talk about it when it's taken to the extreme. But I personally don't necessarily think nationalism is a bad thing. It has to be tempered right.
Yeah, I agree too. And it's the same thing as far as with politics and all. Um, Especially if you look at American politics, you have extremes on both ends, on the left wing and the right wing. And honestly, the more intelligent people that I have met, they're usually somewhere in the middle. They take the best of both sides and minimize the negatives of the extremes. And so, like you just skillfully pointed out, the Olympics is a form of the best of nationalism. It's a friendly competition. Nobody loses their lives. No nation is being taken over. It's a fair ground example of nations coming together and competing to see, for that particular point in time, who's the best at whatever event. It's when you have individuals that go to the extremes and beyond, where things like radicalism, nationalism, socialism, they get thrown in there, but then they start to have a negative connotation tied to them because of the extremes of the people who shout them out or do actions in regards to those type of affiliations.
Right. Exactly. Totally. So there is a word that there's a word that's very rarely mentioned, and it's polarization. You're seeing in
Mm-hmm.
the United States of America right now. Um, and I said this months ago, regardless of who wins the election, the polarization remains the same. And we're seeing it actually globally. Every country, they're deeply divided. And winning or losing an election will not make that polarization go away overnight. So as you're seeing, America remains deeply polarized. So where I'm going with this is that instead of looking at terms like nationalism or socialism, it's the polarization, because ultimately that's how the elites maintain control over the masses, divide and conquer, bread and circuses. So I find that of interest. So, it's a difficult conversation to have with most people, because there's a reason why most people are the masses. They fall under the different forms of population control, and they
Mm-hmm.
believe things that they say that are presented to them at face value, when none of it is. You have to do a deeper dive and understand why these things are actually happening, what's being presented to you. Even when you see people lose lives and things happen globally, socially, economically, you have to be able to dispassionately take a step back and examine and understand what's the true impetus behind this, and learn to follow the money. Who benefits and where does the money go? If you follow drugs, you're going to end up with drug dealers. But if you follow the money, there's no telling where you're going to end up.
Very true. Very true. And that actually ties in back to Benito. Now, on the last episode we left off on, we started to see Benito's ideology start to shift and transform. So, growing up, he was heavily influenced by his father as far as politics and all, but his father was a staunch left wing supporter. And Benito, as he started to kind of feel his way around growing up, despite the whole hilarious stabbing people in the back, or trying to stab people overall, and just being a playground bully. you know he was all about uh, um, forms of communism, forms of liberalism and whatnot. But then towards the end of the episode, we started to see that even he too, the pendulum was slowly starting to swing over to the right side. And not just the right side, period, but on the extreme end of the right side. And this particular episode, where we're going to start off going into his journalism and his career in the newspaper, that would eventually lead to his influence on the political side. Suddenly now, someone let me just give this caveat. I find it funny how you have a person who started off as a staunch left wing supporter, believed in everything liberalism and all, but then once he started getting some play into politics, he suddenly swings to the other side of the extreme. And I find it funny because the current president of the United States of America, who is going to be leaving office in the coming few days, what most people don't remember or are blind to remember, the man was a staunch Democrat until the day he decided to run for president. Then
As,
he switched over to the right side.
as was his father. Donald
Mm-hmm.
Trump was a lifelong Democrat, registered Democrat in the city of New York. Forget the Florida thing. That's where that's his official residence now. But he's born and raised in New York. That's where his business is. He's a native New Yorker.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a staunch Democrat, supported Democrats. In fact, for everyone who likes to watch YouTube, you can go into YouTube and just pull up Donald Trump supporting Hillary Clinton. When she was the senator from New York, he is on camera giving interviews saying he's a staunch supporter of Senator Hillary Clinton,
Mm-hmm.
thought that she was doing a fine job. It wasn't until Barack Hussein Obama decided to run for, was it election or re-election, that
Mm-hmm.
he decided to run for president and as a Republican. But again, we've seen this before, because three-term Republican Mayor Michael Bloomberg did the same thing. Lifelong
Mm-hmm.
Democrat, but when it came time to run for politics, he switched parties, which goes back to what I said earlier: population control. all about manipulating the masses. People get caught up in Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, left wing or right wing. It's all the same bird. And as long as
Hmm.
you believe that game, you are getting played like a fiddle. You are the living example of Pavlov and his experiment.
Very right about that, the Pavlov experiment. And it's something how even that experiment, as basic as it looks, when you apply it to human interaction, it's almost scary how it's so much easy for humans to be influenced just by what they see on TV or what they're hearing over the radio or YouTube or whatnot. And they literally take things at face value and don't take the time to think, okay, well, let me do some research. Let me hear this particular story. Let me hear the opposite of that story. And then I could come to my conclusion somewhere in the middle. No, a lot of folks today will literally take what is said over the airways, over television, on their social media, and just run buck wild with it. Like, and that's why I laugh because it's like when you look at World War II, which, in my opinion, even though propaganda existed well before World War II, it really started to, as they say, get the engines running during this time period from the 1920s upward. When you look at how propaganda was utilized from politics, from military, from education, from foreign policies and all, it's just like this is where, you know, technology, you really see the growth of technology from that point on, because
Absolutely.
as technology gets better, the propaganda just runs even more amok.
Say what you will about Joseph Goebbels. The man was an absolute genius because he understood human psychology and he knew how to skillfully craft and produce propaganda to elicit the emotional responses of the German people. And it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. But
Mm-hmm.
the same thing, I see it every day. All someone has to do is come out and say something, people believe it. And if you say it with conviction, they double strong believe it. It's like all you have to do is just be loud about it or be vociferous about it, be forceful about it. Oh, wow, it has to be true because he's so passionate about it. It has to be true. It's like, hey, bro, have you taken time to actually research yourself? Well, no, not really, but he was so passionate about the way that he said it. Oh, okay, gotcha. So you haven't actually done any research. In fact, you haven't done any research to deconstruct the opinion. Because even if you agree with it, look at other information to take it apart. Because anything that cannot withstand scrutiny demands further investigation.
Mm-hmm.
If it stands up to what it is, then you're going to have zero problem looking up alternative viewpoints or information to deconstruct this point of view. That's what an intelligent thinking person should do. But there's a difference between someone who claims that they're a thinking person and one who actually uses that thing on top of their shoulders for more than just a hat rack. And that's as far as I'll go down that rabbit hole.
Likewise, my friend, likewise. I feel the same way. So let's jump right into the Peter Novel's biography of Mussolini, which the link to the Barnes and Noble's book is found in the description. So you could definitely buy the book yourself and read up on the same pages that we're reading. So the chapter we left off talks about the journalist. And it says Mussolini's experience as a journalist was very important because it was to reveal to him the importance of propaganda. He soon became bored with his post in the Trentino, and after 6 months, changed jobs and went to work for Cesare Battisti, the chief editor of the newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia. Mussolini was effusive about Battisti, a nationalist who was executed by the Austrians during the First World War, whom he described as a noble and proud soul. But he only actually worked for Battisti for a month. Nevertheless, it was an invaluable apprenticeship, providing Mussolini with the technical knowledge of journalism he needed. Il Popolo was a well-known local newspaper, not just the sort of news sheet he was responsible for in the Trentino. This 7-month period as a journalist was also categorized by what had become the norm in Mussolini's behavior. His language in print was unrestrained and violent, and resulted in imprisonment on several occasions as the Austrian authorities were outraged by his extremism. He did not, however, as he later claimed, get expelled from the Trentino because he wrote that it should be Italian and not Austrian. In fact, he deemed such an annexation impractical in 1909. What brought about his expulsion was the revolutionary language in his newspapers, which contrasted with the milder language of his socialist colleagues. They preferred reformist socialism, which sought to improve the conditions of the workers, rather than support outright revolution and the bloody overthrow of the existing capitalist system. We're going to talk on that later. It seems likely that Mussolini's fellow socialists were glad to see the back of him when he was expelled. Most of them were reformists, rather than the sort of international revolutionary socialists that Mussolini posed as. Their differences with him did, however, reflect the major division in the socialist world, which had come with the reformers' revolt against revolutionary Marxism in 1900. This followed the publication of a book by the German Bernstein, the father of revisionism and therefore of social democracy, in 1899, under the title of Evolutionary Socialism. Mussolini rejected such hearsay as a betrayal of international socialism, just as he then regarded patriotism as a petty bourgeois vice, although this made his relationship with the nationalist Battisti somewhat odd. So, what we see here is Mussolini getting experience in journalism. And as many folks will know, journalism is really how propaganda became, you could say, it's the birthplace of propaganda. Because keep in mind, before the radio, before television, even before telegrams, the way most people back in those days get their news was through the newspaper. And so back in those times, the journalists had a lot of freedom to pretty much not only report the news of the day, but also kind of add their own little twist in regards to how they feel about the news of the day or how others feel about it. So as you can see here, Mussolini realized that through journalism that he could really start to influence the masses, no matter, if it has to start out small and only a few people take up the newspapers and whatnot, but just that little influence, you suddenly will start to see a huge domino effect.
Absolutely. And the word propaganda, first of all, was in the common global lexicon. It was not until after World War II. Joseph Goebbels, who was the head of the Ministry of Propaganda, it wasn't until after the war that the word propaganda was given negative connotation. Before then, it was in the popular lexicon as any other word and was not seen as a bad thing. It was commonly used. Propaganda. It was information. It was news. It was news that had a particular slant, but it was not seen as a bad thing, as was the U.S. War Department. It it was renamed the Department of Defense after the war, Every country had a War Department. So everything that we've just talked about, that you just shared with us about Mussolini's experience in politics, running afoul of law enforcement because of his views expressed in his journalism, and discovering the power of propaganda. For anyone who has been following this series, this is the exact, once again, exact roadmap followed by Adolf Hitler, followed by Winston Churchill, followed by Joseph Stalin. And once again, I have to say, it is amazing how these men mirrored each other and how they ended up in their positions of absolute power.
Exactly. And even I'm glad you mentioned about Goebbels and his influence as far as how he was able to really popularize the term propaganda. When we start to kind of get into, excuse me, his interactions with Hitler and how Hitler even played a role in influencing him to write certain papers and pamphlets in during the beginning of the Nazi Party, as far as when they would meet up together at the bars and converse with each other. The way Goebbels was able to just masterfully use words and really struck a chord in the people that read them. Like you mentioned before, Goebbels was a genius. You can decide as far as, the intents of how he used his skillful oratorial and written skills and whatnot, but you have to still come to the conclusion the way the man was able to write and really put information out there for people to read about and to hear about, dutifully masterful. And like we're seeing here with Mussolini, Mussolini is starting to see that, hey, here's an avenue for me where I can express my thoughts to the world and they will have to read it. And even though it cost him expulsion in regards to his extremism and as far as how he feels about overtaking the capital and all, which, by the way, since that was mentioned, I find it interesting how. Let me just give this caveat. Okay, this is not as far as choosing sides. This is not about how I feel about the recent events that happens and everything. I'm just calling how I see it. With that stated, I find it interesting how a few people took the words of a tweet that was blasted out for the entire world, not just America, but just out in the entire world, and you have a people run amok and literally cause cause an insurrection that hasn't happened in over 200 years. That right there, when I saw how all of that played out, I said to myself, this is why we're doing this series. Because if people want to understand why this has happened and how did all of this got started, it's like, look no further than what the history books say, and especially the history books of World War II.
Um, I with deference, to all the media, um, personally, and again, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm way off base. Personally, I don't see how those actions rise to the level of insurrection. I don't see how a handful of people storming the Capitol building, which is a bad thing, which is unheard of, which is, it is what it is. Again, I don't see how those individuals doing that rises to the level of insurrection. The military was in no way compromised. The president nor the vice president were never in threat of danger. And despite U.S. politicians on camera saying, "We feared for our lives. We thought we were going to be assassinated." But none of you were actually seen by any of these protesters. None of you were ever within arm's reach of any of these protesters. So, with indefinitely, again, this to me is tantamount to population control. You're seeing how the media says something and people accept it at face value. And just because academics repeat it and politicians repeat it does not make it true. You have to be able to dispassionately set these things aside and investigate it and scrutinize it yourself. And does it meet all the criteria of scrutinization? And I personally, I disagree. It doesn't. It comes nowhere near the level of insurrection.
Yeah,
Protest, yes,
I
but insurrection, not even close.
I would definitely say it was an overblown riot in regards of the people.
Right.
The people were just too influenced. I will say that, but it definitely wasn't something to where an all out battle, guns ablazing, buildings on fire and whatnot. If people can look at the videos and see that it wasn't really on the level of a true insurrection. To me, if you want to talk about an insurrection type, that's on the level of a coup d'état, where it's literally a hostile takeover, where armed forces are literally coming through and taking no prisoners. That what we saw on the Capitol. Like I said, it was just a riot that had gone wrong. But again, propaganda.
Indeed. Right.
This was a perfect example, as I mentioned before. This was a perfect example of how propaganda, and especially with today's technology, how it literally can influence the masses. And when it's put into the wrong hands or the right hands, whoever feels as far as who's doing what, point being, the masses just take it and just run with it.
Absolutely. And, not for nothing, but okay, you know what? Correct, correct, correct. Let's move on because we can do an intellectual deep dive on this for about the next hour. And I'm of the opinion our intellectual deep dive will be 1,000 times better than what you're seeing on the media. So let's just move on.
Exactly. So let's go ahead and move on to the next paragraph. And shout out to my Maholi. Good to see you. All right. Next it says the period between 1909 and 1914 saw Mussolini's views change slowly. In 1909, he was still an international socialist following the Marxist line that patriotism was a middle class vice and that socialists should be working for the liberation of the international proletariat, or proletariat, excuse me. It was ridiculous, Mussolini argued in his newspaper, that Italian peasants were impoverished while the country wasted valuable resources on military spending and colonial adventures. Giolidi's decision to attack Libya in 1911, in a misguided attempt to appease Italian nationalists on the political right, was a godsend for Mussolini. He attacked the invasion ferociously, claiming that it was a crime against humanity. More than 20 years later, the same man would be responsible for the gassing and slaughter of thousands of defenseless Ethiopian tribesmen. His articles equated patriotism with imperialism and militarism. So, as we see here, Mussolini, his views are starting to change slowly but surely, as Peter Neville pointed out, but also too, he's starting to go more so into patriotism. And what I find interesting is if I could equate it a little bit to today's time, I've even heard recently some people who were against the Trump administration and are now happy that he's about to be gone within a few days. Suddenly, I'm starting to hear that they're now talking about the importance of patriotism, the importance of nationalism. And especially as far as within the pandemic, I've even heard people say that it's time to reopen the economy. And again, this is why with politics, it doesn't matter if you're left wing or right wing, it's still the same bird. You will hear both sides use similar language points.
Because it's all it's all population control. And again, people are want to. It's Pavlov and his experiment. Things are given to you, and people follow a specific train of thought, and they think that they're thinking, but their thinking has already been done for them. It has been pre-programmed for them. You know, it just amazes me how the things and the lines of thought that people espouse, and I look at them like, you're still looking in the wrong direction. You don't get it. You're not seeing it. But as the old saying goes, it is easier to fool a man than to tell him he has in fact been fooled. So it's of interest to see how this plays out. But so many people are looking at this at all the wrong angles, from all the wrong directions.
Yep, absolutely.
And again, we're seeing it's reflected. It's reflected here throughout. The same themes and motifs reflect themselves throughout history. We saw it in Germany with Hitler. From the years before leading up to the beer hall putsch and the years after, all the way up to 1932. We saw it with Stalin. We saw it with Churchill. And now again here we're seeing it with Il Duce. You know, when people look at things, they look at things as they're presented to them on face value. And even when there's blood spilled in the streets, more than likely you're still looking at the wrong things from the wrong angles. But again, it's easier to fool a man than it is to convince him that he has in fact been fooled.
Very true. Definitely can't argue with that. All right. The next paragraph says, at the Socialist Party Congress at Reggio Emilia in 1912, a ragged-looking and already slightly balding Mussolini made a fiery and impressive speech denouncing the Libyan invasion, and moderate socialist leaders such as Bissolati, who adopted bourgeois policies. Bissolati's particular offense had been to visit the royal palace to congratulate King Victor Emmanuel on surviving an assassination attempt. Mussolini regarded this tugging of the forelock to the monarchy as unacceptable for socialists. He had argued that the successful assassination of King Umberto by an anarchist in 1900 was justified as an act of protest. Mussolini's speech went down well with party activists, and his motion to expel Bissolati was carried by a large majority. At the age of only 29, Mussolini, together with his mentor Angelica Balabanov, found themselves members of the dominant grouping in the party directorate. A few months later, Mussolini's first great triumph as a demagogue was followed by his appointment as editor of the socialist newspaper Avanti. He now had a national platform, but he ran the paper like the dictator he was to become. No dissent was tolerated, and he ruthlessly sacked older journalists who might not agree with his particular line. The reformist line of people such as Bissolati was roundly denounced, but Mussolini's vivid, aggressive tone sold newspapers. he was able to double Avanti's circulation, as he boasted in his biography. For once, the boast was true. I like how the author just kind of throws a little jab in there that, for once, he actually is telling the truth.
Because it's iconic. It is iconic. El Duce standing on a ledge, arms at his side or behind him, chest pumped out, bouncing from side to side, twisting and turning. It's iconic. When you think of El Duce, that's the first thing that comes to your mind. You know, a little short man with classic Napoleon complex.
Exactly. And it's something how so he gets upgraded from a local newspaper outlet to now he is somewhat in charge of a national publication in Avanti. And right then and there we start to see, which we was already seeing hints of it as far as with his childhood, but as far as what he would do as a dictator, this lovely paragraph highlights in regards of, hey, if you don't agree with me, you're getting the boot. Despite if somebody comes with logic, somebody comes through with, a constructive criticism, would say, in his mind, it's like, if you are not in line with what I'm talking about, here's your pink slip and you could go. And so, yeah.
It needs to be said. People want to believe the establishment. People want to believe what they see and what they hear and take it all for face value. Politicians understand this. They know this. That's why they lie to you. But people innately want to believe the lie. They want to believe the lies that they're told because they don't want to accept that what they're seeing at face value is all BS. And that's what politicians trade on. And that's how population control works. Because the masses do have to work for the controlling elites anyway. And that is the 800-pound gorilla in the room and the truth of politics that no one wants to admit.
That definitely goes down the rabbit hole. Just that statement in and of itself is kind of like, people not ready for that truth, even though it's very obvious from the get-go. But they will believe in everything politicians tell them. Because in their minds, as long as somebody is telling them what to do and how to do it, they have some meaning in life. So,
and the funny thing is, excuse me, even if they disagree with what they're being told, and it gives them something to rage against the machine, just the fact they're raging against the perceived machine, they're raging against the machine that is what's put in front of their face, what's right in front of their face. Because they never take the time to step back and realize that even that rage against the machine is a Pavlovian response. You've been programmed for that. Again, this is uncomfortable. People are going to disagree. They don't want to hear it. I understand that because it's uncomfortable, because it challenges the very nature of their reality. That even your protest, even your indignation, even your outrage, it's all BS because it's a Pavlovian response. You're outraged at the wrong things. Someone told you, pre-programmed you to outrage and be indignant against these things. But as you said, I'm going down the rabbit hole, so time to stop, turn around, and come right back out.
Exactly. All right. So the next paragraph says, in electoral terms, too, Mussolini's hardline, anti-reformist position seemed to pay dividends. In the 1913 Italian general election, the socialist vote went up to almost 1 million, and the party got 53 seats in parliament. Mussolini himself tried and failed to get elected in his home seat of Forli in the Romagna, but was subsequently elected as a town councillor in Milan, marking a move for him to a bigger, urban industrial stage. What was clear by now was that Mussolini was no Democrat. His speeches rammed home the point that the masses needed only a blind faith in the dynamic leadership of ruthless, charismatic leaders such as
Bingo.
himself. You know what? Let me put a pin on that. But before we continue,
Okay.
I find it interesting, and this wasn't talked about much from either side, right wing, left wing, whatever. But I remember specifically when the current President Trump, was running for office, and on one of his tours that he made on the West Coast, he said, "This is one of the reasons why I love the poor and the uneducated."
Uneducated. There you go.
And it just went over the heads of not only his supporters, but
Everyone.
even people on the left. And I was just like, wow. Like you pointed out, the indoctrination of the Pavlov style of politics, it was like, wow.
He told you. He told you. You're all trained puppies hopping to the leash. He told you. And yet everyone, Ebony, Caucasian, Asian, Spanish, everyone missed it. All missed it. He told you what he was doing, and yet you missed it. It's brilliant. You know, it's like, to draw a comparison to anime. It's like when someone tells you what they're about to do. Vegeta tells you he's about to hit you with his Gallic gun, and then he hits you with it anyway, and you fall. So, yeah, amazing. And you know, for those who are still uncomfortable, because I can hear the teeth grinding right now. If you look at American presidents, every time the presidency changes party, the person who was elected is perceived by the public as being the opposite of the outgoing president. Let that sink in. But again, that's public perception only. And what are elections? Elections are popularity contests.
Yep.
No one really studies history or issues or policies. It's a popularity contest. So, again, saying things that are very uncomfortable, but that's what this series is about. It's about taking an intellectual deep dive into history and World War I and World War II, and not just merely regurgitating the stories we've all been told. Because a lot of those stories, they do not stand up to scrutiny for one simple reason. History is written by the victors. Well, I'm sorry, two reasons. People don't research accepted history.
Yep. In other words, they just take things at face value. Whatever the victors say, that's what goes. And the other portion of history that ties in to what the victors talk about, but they don't want to mention, well, we'll just completely ignore it. And it's funny, before we continue, it's funny you mentioned anime. And Eisenstein, you're going to love this reference. I remember I was watching an episode of Bleach, and there was a scene when Eisen was he's going to El Noche. I hope I got the name right. Las Noche. And he said, it was a profound statement. He said that Soul Society have ran with no leaders for so long. Now it's time for a new leader. And that new leader will have to be me, since I'm the only one that could run things through. And as much as he got people angry, a lot of folks had to acknowledge the fact that he was a very strong Shinigami. And very few were willing to go toe to toe with him. So it is again just comes right back to what we talk about as far as with the masses and all. If there's a leader who has that perception, forget about background and everything. If he just has that perception of strength and he is good with his words, people just fall right in line and do not second guess. It's amazing. It's amazing to watch that.
It's so funny. It's so funny you say that because when I look back at we know Adolf Hitler was a very charismatic person. For those who've actually set aside the emotion and studied him, and yes, I understand you don't actually speak German, but he was a very charismatic person. If you look at the neutral documentaries about Adolf, the same for Joseph Stalin, the same for Winston Churchill, and the same for El Duce. So when I look at American presidents, Donald Trump, zero charisma. Everything that he says, attacked. Barack Hussein Obama, very intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
Someone I can sit down and converse with all day long, but not very charismatic. Everything he said, attacked. Baby Bush, very charismatic. Dumber than a bag of rocks, but very charismatic. No one questioned any of the idiotic things that he said or did. William Jefferson Clinton, another poster boy of charisma. People would not attack things that he said or did. Funny enough, they attacked the Monica Lewinsky thing, of all things to get riled up about. You get riled up about the president getting a BJ and whatever. So Bush Sr., zero charisma at all. Everything he said, attacked. Ronald Wilson Reagan. For everyone who thinks that Donald J. Trump is such a horrible president, for me, I've said it before and I'll say it again. In my opinion, Ronald Wilson Reagan is the worst president America's had in 100 years. And I can state my argument 1,000 different ways. The point I'm trying to go here is, and I look before him, President Carter. No charisma. Everything he said, attacked. Before him, President Ford. He was also dull. Everything that he said, attacked. Before him, Richard Milhouse Nixon. Very charismatic person. Nobody attacked anything he said or did. So I'm looking here and I'm thinking, and this is just off the top of my head, leaders who are charismatic, they can say and do anything and get away with anything. Leaders who are dull, whether through lack of intelligence or great intelligence, everything that they say gets scrutinized. So again, I say all that and I point it out to drive home the point that you eloquently made. It all comes down to charisma and popularity. And if you are a strong personality, a charismatic person, you can do and say and get away with anything.
Yep, absolutely. And we're going to see more of this charismatic from Benito in these next few paragraphs coming up to highlight what you're saying. And so it says, what was clear by now was that Mussolini was no Democrat. His speeches ran home the point that the masses needed only a blind faith in the dynamic leadership of ruthless, charismatic leaders such as himself. He told a lover at the time that he was going to be a man of destiny. When she asked, like Napoleon, he replied with his usual bombast, no, greater than Napoleon.
Bingo.
Like you have pointed out, man of charisma can easily go about their business with little to no resistance. If people kind of bring it into, well, okay, we'll look at it this way. If people were wondering, how is it that the last two presidents, President Trump and President Barack Obama, how is it that these two were able to influence the masses, whether it's left wing or right wing, at the height of their presidency? You have to come to terms with the fact both of them were very charismatic leaders. They understood the meaning of expression, the meaning of having oratorial skills, and being able to be good with the words they present. And knowing how people like to take the lazy route and just believe anything and everything at face value, they just follow suit without resistance.
Yeah, I say it all. I came to the realization a long time ago. Human beings, and this is globally consistent. Human beings want someone to lay their head on their chest, pat them on the back of the head, and say, "Baby, it's gonna be okay. I got this. I'll do all the thinking for you." Inherently,
Yep.
that's what people want. That's what people want. And it is easier to fool a man than to convince him he has in fact been fooled. And I see so many people who make such, in their minds, educated and erudite arguments. And I sit there and I scratch my head and I look at them like, you have no idea. It's like a computer. Garbage in, garbage out, and I know that offends people. Some reason I seem to offend people, but I look at people and with these discussions and their conversations, and it's not that I'm the smartest individual in the room. No, not at all. It's just that I'm looking where you're not, and if you were to look in the same place, you would recognize the same things for yourself. Because for any individual who stops and takes the time to look where the masses aren't, they see the same things for themselves. It's just plain as day. But it takes the ability to just say, wait, 1 second. You know what? I'm going to stop and take a step back and challenge everything that I know to be true. Because if I'm right, then it's still going to be right. But you know what? What if I'm wrong? But I'm at least willing to at least see where it is. If everyone is looking in this direction, what's going on over here in this direction where everyone is not looking?
Yep. And Isaac was saying the two paragraphs I posted, I think, describes it perfectly. Another quote by Isaac. Yeah, again, people, in fact, Isaac gonna like this reference too, because you actually mentioned this on one of your previous streams. Isaac made this statement talking about on Bleach that admiration leads to indecisiveness. When you admire a person so much so that you just blindly follow whatever they say or do, essentially something that could actually help you along the way or actually get you out of danger, because you feel like it goes against what the leader or somebody you admire tells you to do, you just simply go against the grain. And this is one reason why when I tell a lot of folks that there will be people that unfortunately can't be saved, because in their minds they have no sense of self-reflection. They have no sense of who they are from within. They have to rely on some sort of external factor to give them meaning in life. And that's why, years after years, decades after decades, and centuries after centuries, dictators still run the world. Why? Because you have people who simply can't make decisions for themselves.
That's why the term the masses applies. That's why the term population control applies. My first year in college, my macroeconomics professor said, "He who controls the dissemination of information controls the masses." That has stuck with me to this very day. I never forgot. He was the first person who said that to me. I looked it up, I researched it. You know, my last year of high school, I started to become a student of human nature and study the history of society and sociology, and truer words were never said. He who controls the dissemination of information controls the masses. And once
Mm-hmm.
you have that, nothing else matters. Nothing else really matters. Because the rest, the people will do it for you. You see,
Yep.
that's one thing. You don't need whips and chains. Control a man's mind, he enslaves himself.
Yep.
So you may wake up in your own bed with your own roof over your own head and you drive to work in your nice fancy car. But if you're going to repeat the same arguments that the media espouts to you, and you hold the same long held viewpoints of whatever demographic or group you happen to be a part of, then guess what, my friend? You are nothing but a pawn on the chessboard. You are exhibiting a classic Pavlovian response. And that lets me know you don't get it.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, before we go deeper down that rabbit hole, we'll go
Right,
ahead
sorry.
and no, oh no, I went down that rabbit hole too, so we both will have to jump back out of that hole.
Right.
So, all right. So the next paragraph says, "For a man walking with destiny, in his own eyes at least, Mussolini gave an impression of nervous indecisiveness in the so-called Red Week of June 1914, when massive street demonstrations rocked the government. Smaller towns were even taken over by socialist and anarchist militants, tax registers destroyed, and railway stations occupied. All this was in response to the killing of 3 anti-militarist demonstrators in the town of Ancona. Even the fairly conservative CGL, the Socialist Trade Union Confederation, joined in and supported the demand for a general strike. Red Week appears to have been totally spontaneous, but Mussolini was taken by surprise. Oh, how swank. He saw the potential for revolution in the mass disturbances, but unlike other socialist leaders, such as Nenni, he stayed at his editorial desk. Oh. Mussolini, the advocate of violent action, took part in just one mass demonstrations. His,
Who does that sound like? A person. Doesn't that sound like a certain German and a certain Briton and a certain Russian, all three of whom had very under distinguished military careers? But I digress.
again, like we mentioned before, it's just funny how it's like a cut and paste with these previous future leaders that we were talking about. Churchill, Adolf, Stalin, and now Mussolini. All three of these people, they had no problems in regards to writing out papers or giving out speeches and everything about how they feel that you need to be a man of action and you need to go and so to speak, we need to take down the big man. But when push come to shove, they turned tail and ran with their tails between their legs.
Bingo. Bingo. Bingo.
But
Bingo.
but yet and still, these guys that we're doing videos about and really giving some background information, these will be the head figures of the greatest wartime event in human history, aka World War II.
I couldn't agree more because World War II is the last global event that has really changed this world. And we'll see how this whole beer flu thing turns out, but that might be the first thing since World War II to really permanently change every aspect of human life on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
World War II.
Yep. All right. So next paragraph is actually the intro into Italy's introduction of the First Great War. It says, luckily for Mussolini, his reputation was saved in the short run by the advent of the First World War in July of 1914. Ostensibly, Italy should have entered the war at once, as she had joined the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Germany in 1882. But the Italians argued that Austria-Hungary and Germany had provoked the war, and that the treaty was defensive only in character. Many Italians, however, saw Austria-Hungary as the traditional enemy, whereas Britain and especially France had actively assisted the Risorgimento in the 1860s. There was also the question of the Austrian-administered Trentino, considered by most Italians to be rightfully theirs. In July of 1914, Mussolini was consistent in his demand for Italian neutrality. Like all Marxists at the time, he saw the war as a bourgeois imperialist adventure, which the international working class should boycott. Mussolini maintained this position for several months, but soon came to see it as untenable. Partly this was because it was clear, that the international working class had only rallied around the national flags. In Germany, for example, the large, avowedly Marxist Socialist Democratic Party had, with a few notable exceptions like Rosa Luxemburg, backed the war effort. But it was also because Mussolini could see that the issue of intervention was likely to split the party. Some party comrades had already defected over the issue. So, we see here that the Italians were kind of at a standstill at the beginning of the First Great War. Even though they have signed a treaty to be allies with Germany and Austria-Hungary if war was to ever break out, in their minds, Austria-Hungary was actually, I guess you would say, their mortal enemies. And so, which I find interesting that they would make an alliance with a sworn enemy, but nevertheless, that's for going into histories before World War One. But they were pretty much was like, well, look, we're not going to jump into action because the Germans started this war. Therefore, there's no need for us to really get involved if this was something they started. And what's going to be interesting is how the Italians will later on are hoping for some backlash that the Austrian nation does against Britain that would actually tie off the treaty and have Italy join the Americans, the French, and the British in fighting against their border countries, Austria and Germany.
Yeah, I always got the impression that Mussolini was trying to that his mindset was that he was hoping the government of Italy could somehow play a background role, stay in the shadows, but somehow manipulate events in their favor. Okay, so kind of like waging not so much a cold war, but a shadow war, if that's if
Kind of like supplying the Allies, but not getting your army or any of your military involved.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's like that. Something along those lines. That's always been my personal view on that. I again, maybe I'm wrong. That's only my opinion. Maybe a interpretation of what I saw as Mussolini's actions. But it's funny how there's another old saying: politics makes for strange bedfellows. Because just 20 years later, we see how things changed drastically.
Indeed. So the next paragraph says, slowly, Mussolini began to alter his position to one whereby he conceded that involvement in the First World War might indeed be possible. There was the hope, too, that war might lead to international revolution and the overthrow of capitalism. Subsequently, Mussolini was to distort the chronology of his move towards interventionism. He stated that, inspired by nationalists such as Battisti and Cordani, he was able to drag with me a fraction of the socialists in favor of war. It is certainly true that on the 18th of October, 1914, Mussolini came out in favor of Italian entry into the war against Austria-Hungary and Germany, arguing that Italy could not remain on the sidelines with such crucial events were taking place. By then, Germany's drive to end the war by defeating France in 6 weeks had failed. He did this without consulting colleagues on the editorial board of Avanti, and when the matter was debated, he found himself in a minority of one. Mussolini, therefore, resigned. His lengthy flirtation with socialism had effectively ended, and Mussolini, the extreme nationalist, was emerging. He had also discovered that he was a vibrant and persuasive speaker.
Just like the gentleman who, unfortunately, God damn it, his name escapes me, the gentleman who actually groomed Hitler. Hitler, his path to rise within the German Workers' Party, which was renamed into the Nazi Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, that gentleman so recognized a charisma and a public speaking ability within Hitler and saw a true believer, and he shaped him and molded him and rebranded him into the individual that he became. Unfortunately for him, he didn't realize the monster that he created, and the person who he rebranded to be his public face and mouthpiece actually seized control of the party from him. But again, cut, copy, and paste from Hitler to El Duce to Churchill to Stalin. Every step of the way. It fascinates me. Everything these four men have gone through is a mirror image of each other, every step along the way.
You are so right about that. And be honest with you, and this is just to kind of give some insight for our audience and all, I literally cannot wait when we start to get more into the the emotions of the nations leading up to World War II, the people who assisted these figureheads that we're talking about, especially from Hitler's inner circle, and just the events that were, you could say, pickpocket events that happened from the Treaty of Versailles up until the first guns laid off for World War II. It is going to be hugely interesting to see how these people, how they just got in contact with these head figures and just their small interaction and the things that they would teach these future leaders would just have this massive, and I truly mean it when I say a massive ripple effect by just a small interaction. Like, I can't wait to talk about those particular interactions.
Right. Exactly. I couldn't agree more.
All right. So the next section actually talks a little bit about Mussolini's marriage. It says the years 1909 to 1914 had also been important in Mussolini's personal life. In 1912, just before he took up his post as editor of Avanti, his father, who was such an important influence upon him, died at the early age of 57. His son's respect seems to have been genuine enough. In 1910, Mussolini the philanderer married, threatening to shoot himself if his bride's parents did not agree to the marriage. His wife, Rachel, was, in fact, the daughter of Alessandro Mussolini's mistress.
You can't you can't make this stuff up.
Before I continue, Isaac, he says, it's almost reminded me of Palpatine's rise in power in Star Wars. No one saw how he manipulated everything for them to give him ultimate political power. Indeed. Indeed. And be honest with you, I think George Lucas' portrayal of Star Wars, I think he took a lot of interest from World War II, because you can look at the storyline and you can definitely see some scenes where, hey, this is actually something that's reminiscent to what Hitler did or what Mussolini may have
Yeah.
done. So
I definitely came across that in the 90s when the films came back, when the three prequels came out, Phantom Menace and Clones, and yeah, it hit me like the Empire is Nazi Germany. I got it. Okay, now I see it.
yeah, exactly. But back to this with the potential incest. Now, I'm trying to be careful with my words when I say this, but you have to know that a guy has to be completely off his rocker. He has to really be out of his mind. If he's coming to you and threatening to kill himself if you do not allow him to marry your daughter, who also happens to be his cousin.
Well, I'll say this. I'll say this. In some certain in some certain circles, that's viewed as nothing wrong. So that's all that I can say about that. That's all that I will say about that. Because as you know, off air, I said I am not talking about a certain demographic anymore. So we're
Yeah.
just gonna leave that right where it is.
Yep. Yep. But I'm like Eisen. If I was in that position, I'd be like, okay, man, do you need me to pull the trigger or you're gonna do it?
Yeah, that's like a major red flag. Like, oh, okay, if I don't let you marry my daughter, you're gonna put a bullet in your brain? Okay. Do you want to look me in the eye when I do it, or do you want it in the back of the head? Because if you think I'm letting you anywhere near my baby girl, no. That's enough.
Exactly. All right. So it says here that she did not share her husband's interest in politics, and her focus was overwhelmingly on the family. Rachel had good reason to be jealous about Mussolini's persistent womanizing, but she proved to be a loyal wife. Mussolini's hypocritical statements about the importance of family life can be treated with scorn. He was never faithful to his wife, although they were to have 5 children together. Yet, Rachel had as much insight into his character as anyone, saying that her husband seemed like a lion, but was in reality a pauvre uomo, a poor chap. His children, Etta, Vittorio, Bruno, Romano, and Anna Maria, born as late as 1929 when Mussolini was 46, saw very little of him, and Mussolini conceded that he was not the best of fathers. Okay, I'm gonna move on. I mean, we already talked about the copy and paste of the fathers of these leaders being bad influence and everything, and now Mussolini himself sharing some of the same attributes that his father did to him. So, as they say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Monsters are not born; they're made.
It says it was fortunate for the children that Rachel proved to be a dutiful wife and mother, although she disliked Rome and would not travel there after her husband came to power, unless forced to do so. According to Etta, in an interview given in 1995, which has only recently come to light, even Rachel was driven by her husband's inattention into taking a lover. Mussolini, although apparently surprised, was hardly in a position to be critical. Those who knew them, in any case, observed that he seemed to be rather frightened of his own wife. Nevertheless, Rachel could not prevent her husband from having lengthy affairs with Margherita Sarfatti and Lida Raffanelli. Both women were a little older than Mussolini, and in Raffanelli's case, Mussolini claimed to have found a soulmate, although they often quarreled bitterly. Isaac, you beat me to the punch.
No surprise there. No surprise.
Okay, just to kind of throw a little nugget for our audience that are listening in or listen on the replay. There's a reason they call the Italians during this time the blacks of Europe. And I'm going to just leave it there. Not go any further. But for those who know the inner talkings of what I'm mentioning, especially Isaac, because we definitely talk a lot on the back end too. This should be of no surprise. But in any case, he seemed to be intoxicated by the fact that Raffanelli had spent some time in Egypt, and he spoke of her oriental allure. Their affair also coincided with Mussolini's time in Milan, with its sophisticated urban chic. But the lovers fell out over the Italian decision to enter the war, which Lida Raffanelli denounced in print. So, I mean, I believe this section kind of speaks for itself. You know, Mussolini tries to paint this image of some patronage and the importance of family or whatnot, but an absentee father he was. And not only was he an absentee father, but essentially he rather just deal with, as it appeared, he must rather deal with women of older sophistication than to really deal with his wife.
And it's funny because he learned that from his father.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, Stalin learned that from his father. Churchill never really exhibited that behavior, but he had a traditional British upbringing in that he was raised up by nannies and boarding schools because Winston Churchill came from money and wealth, so he never developed a proper relationship with his father. As for Adolf, we already know the horrible man that his father was and the relationship that he had with his father. And I find an interesting comparison, not a correlation, a comparison. Adolf Hitler never publicly took a wife, and he publicly presented the image to German women that he was an eligible bachelor, but he
Mm-hmm.
purposely hid his relationship with Ava Brown on purpose to keep that image. And I'm sure that that was Goebbels' idea, propaganda.
Yep. Indeed. And so far, up until this point in time, leading up to the end of World War I, only Mussolini has children, or at least has some sort of his own type of family. Whereas, like you mentioned, Hitler is pretty much for the rest of his life in the public eyes is seen as a bachelor. Joseph Stalin, actually, he did marry, but I don't recall in our short biography of him if he has had children yet, although we know that he was married before the war. And then Churchill, at this point in time, he was mainly focused on his political life as well as painting this picture of him being some sort of war hero when really he he was more like schizophrenic and actually committed treason in some form or fashion, but that's a subject later on down the road.
He
So
provided aid and comfort to the enemy. So,
yep,
you know what?
yep,
That makes you a traitor by definition. But he got away with it. But
yep.
whatever.
No, I agree. I agree. So I find it interesting how it seems like okay, I'm not trying to say this the wrong way, but I'm one where I'm just gonna call it like I see it. It seems to me that up until this point right now, it's the one who has less intelligence is the one who is procreating. if you kind of look at it in that point of
Yeah,
view.
I know exactly where you're going with that.
Ah, man. Uh,
Yeah.
there's a reason why Mussolini did not like intellectualism and all, but for somehow he feels like family life is important and everything. So oxymoron. But we'll
Which is
we'll, we'll
funny.
mhm.
Which is funny because of the four, he was the only one who disliked intellectuals. Stalin liked intellectuals. We know Churchill did, and we know Hitler did. But again, Mussolini had Napoleon's complex, and he was not the most intelligent man. So of course he's going to dislike intellectuals. Who wants to have power and be in a room where you're the dumbest person in the room? But you know what? I guess that's how. You know what? No, no, I'm not gonna go there. I'm not gonna go there. Move on.
Okay, yeah. Let's move right along because this chapter is almost over. Next section is the War and Revolution. Starts off saying Mussolini was both surprised and embittered by the refusal of his socialist colleagues to support his stand on intervention in 1914. His response was to set up his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, which his journalistic flair soon made into a going concern. The paper was still avowedly socialist, but Mussolini took on board some surprising financial bedfellows, an early indication that in his ambitious strive for power, he was drifting further and further to the right. Those who funded the paper included the industrial giant Fiat, which would clearly gain from Italian entry into the war. Agrarian interests and foreign powers such as Britain and France, who were keen to get Italy involved as well. It has also been suggested that the Italian government itself funded the paper after eventual entry. Mussolini angrily rejected accusations made at the time that he was taking bribes. His already clear commitment to Italian intervention in the war also made it unlikely that the editorial position of his newspaper, was actually influenced by those who funded him. Now, this is interesting. And good sir, you have mentioned this yourself. When we talk about follow the money, This is a perfect example of the phrase, he who pays the piper calls the tune.
You better believe it.
So, in this case, for Mussolini, he's already being backed up by not only the government, the Italian government, but he's also being backed by Fiat and some other governmental officials from foreign countries to perpetuate the country's eventual entry into the war. Now, bring that up to today's time. If you want to understand why certain mainstream media talk about certain subjects so profoundly, and they just keep hammering home, each and every night, whether it's on TV, social media, the radio stations or not, the logical thing to do, not the emotional thing, the logical thing to do would be
Uh-oh.
find out who funds them.
That sounds a lot like something I say. Follow the
Yep.
money.
Yes, sir. This is right up your alley.
Nothing else matters. Nothing else matters. Your indignation, your outrage, your social causes, they don't matter. Follow the money. At the end of the day, money makes the world go round. It isn't the P word. It's the M word. It's money. Because the P word follows the money. Follow the money.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain phrase that likes to get repeated. If you want to know who controls you, look at who you can't talk about or who you can't criticize. Well, I'm sure, and I agree at one time that used to be the case. I would strongly argue that's not so much the case now. If you want to know who controls you, follow the money.
Mm-hmm.
Because just because you're not, or you don't think you can talk about a certain group, that could also be a Pavlovian response as well.
Mm-hmm.
Follow the money. Because even a certain group who you may think, oh, you can't talk about that group. You know what? 9 out of 10 times that group, intellectually anyway, is in the same boat as you are, my friend.
Mm-hmm.
But see, you can't see that stuck behind emotional arguments. But I digress.
No, sir, you're very spot on. Like I said, this will be right up your alley because as you see, and as the audience see as well, Mussolini was only empowered, especially in this case, starting his own newspaper, because he was being funded by people behind the scenes who have pretty good influence, not only on the masses, but essentially how the world functions. And so, like you always point out, follow the money. And I challenge anybody that's listening in. If you listen to CNN or any other mainstream media, for that matter, even Fox News and all that, just one day, just sit down and ask yourself a question. Who's actually funding these big media companies? And I can tell you this much. It's not hard to go on the internet and find out who is supplying the funds to these companies. You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised what you find out. But again, that's going down the rabbit hole. I just wanted to give that little thought because, like I said, this is right up Paul, your alley, where he talks about follow the money. This is a clear example of how Mussolini was able to start a little bit of his propaganda to help influence the nation to get into World War One. And that was one of the reasons why I played that clip at the beginning of the stream of how the media at the time really wanted to play out, this huge success that the Italian army was getting when they enter the war and how much they're taking over and whatnot. Again, propaganda. And again, who's funding that message?
Well, CBS is owned by Viacom. Last time I checked,
Mm-hmm.
unless that has changed. I know there was some merger or something going on between them and Paramount, I believe. But anyway, Viacom is a communications company. NBC has been owned by GE for decades. Fox Snooze is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who's an Australian media magnate. ABC is owned through two or three different companies, but ultimately it's owned by Disney.
Mm-hmm.
So TNT and CNN, MSNBC, CNBC. So you look, follow the money. All you have to do is follow the money. And George Soros funded a specific movement, which I won't mention. But unless you've been living under a rock, by now you know what certain social, quote unquote, supposed to be outrage group is in fact funded by George Soros and does not have best interests of certain people. But again, follow the money. That's the thrust here. Not discussing the moral arguments. We can have that discussion in a different venue and at a different time. But follow the money, because nothing is as what it seems. And one last thing, and I've been trying to hold this, and I said I wouldn't go here, but the confidence man talks about things that are important to you. The confidence man talks about things that are emotional to you. And once the confidence man gets your emotions riled up, and the confidence man gains your trust, then the confidence man puts his hand in your pocket, and that's how he runs a con. And that's why he's called a con man. That term used to be the confidence man, because he gains your confidence through lies and deception. That's why it's called a con, the confidence man. So let that sink in.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely let the audience marinate on that as we continue forward. Next it says, Il Popolo d'Italia, the people of Italy, first appeared on the 15th of November, 1914. Mussolini now argued that war would lead to social revolution in Italy, but also that Italians could not remain, quote, inner spectators of this tremendous drama, unquote, and would show their credentials as a great power on the battlefield. His obsession with the need for Italians to show their military virility became more and more evident in his editorials. Characteristically, Mussolini also claimed that his very first editorial turned a large part of public opinion towards the intervention of Italy in the war, side by side with England and France. This was, of course, a sizable exaggeration. Italian animosity towards Germany's ally, Austria, of long, and did not need Mussolini's polemics in his newspaper to arouse it. But the campaign in Il Popolo was one of many pressures on the then Prime Minister Salandra to enter the war on the side of the Western democracies. But Mussolini's journalistic acuteness made him realize the potency of the Italians' desire for an Alpine frontier, which meant taking the Trentino away from the Austrians. Now we're seeing some interest as to why Mussolini is pushing more and more for Italy to get into the First World War. This has a little bit to do with geopolitics in regards of they feel there needs to be more expansionism.
And who does that sound like?
Sounds just like Germany. Sounds just like Japan. And if you want to make the argument, since we're both of us are neutral on this, also sounds like Britain and America. Because those two countries, we can say what you want, they also practice imperialism and colonialism.
And expansionism. Every country does it. So it's funny how people can get on their high horse after decades or centuries of benefiting of it and pointing the finger and blaming others of doing the same thing that you did.
Yep. So I definitely find it interesting how you have people, especially American history, where they talk about, well, we wanted to spread our influences to other countries to help them learn more about democracy. But it's like, no, you also practice imperialism and expansionism. Don't make it seem like you had a righteous cause. You were just as gullible as the Germans and the Japanese, and in this case, even the Italians during their heyday. But I digress.
Absolutely. Every country is the same, man. Countries, listen, countries don't help each other unless there's something in it for them. Okay, that's human nature. It is what it is. You know, some areas we can rise above, other areas we pretty much stay to the base desires. But countries do not help other countries unless there's something in it for them.
Which again, your famous quote, follow the money. Believe me, this is something people gotta understand. Wars are not cheap. There's a reason why the last atomic bomb was dropped back in 1945 and haven't since then. All right. Next paragraph says, in political terms, Mussolini was open to accusations of glaring inconsistencies. On the one hand, he talked of wars of national liberation against imperialism, saying, for example, that Italy should not claim Trieste and Fiume from a new independent Yugoslavia, because the Yugoslav working class were brothers. But, on the other, he now justified the colonial war in Libya in 1911 to 1912, which he had denounced so ferociously at the time. Socialist window dressing was covering an increasingly aggressive nationalist agenda, but criticism of Mussolini's volte-face needs to be seen in a contemporary context. Britain and France, both more democratic states than Italy, showed no disposition to recognize nationalist aspirations inside their colonial empires, while at the same time offering freedom to the Slav peoples like the Poles and the Czechs inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What cannot be denied, however, is the speed with which Mussolini's opinions changed. For as 1915 went on, he moved even closer to the position of the nationalist right by demanding the annexation of Trieste and Fiume, together with the securing of an Alpine frontier and Italian participation in the carve-up of the Ottoman Turkish Empire in the Middle East, which would undoubtedly follow the defeat of Germany and her allies. Mussolini continued to hammer home the point that Italy's national honor demanded that the country's unwarlike image and inferior status in the eyes of the foreigners. Bismarck had famously remarked that the Italians had a, quote, large appetite for territorial gains, but very poor teeth, be destroyed.
Sounds very reminiscent of the justification of the Monroe Doctrine and the Manifest Destiny. But hey, what do I know?
Oh, we're definitely going to get to that too. Oh boy, gotta love history. The coincidence are not there for no reason. They always play a role in somebody wanting to repeat history. So,
You know, I don't think I want to take this opportunity to repeat something that you used to say, I used to say. We both stopped saying it because, like, we think it's obvious, but people don't study history. The truth is
Mm-hmm.
there, but people don't want to look for it. If you look for it, a lot of the things you've been told, even in schools and by politicians, a lot of it is either misrepresentations or out and out lies. The truth is there. It's in the history. You just have to go and look for it. But people don't want to go look for it. But here, we look for it. And we go wherever the research takes us. We don't have bias. We're human. We may have preconceptions, but we go where the research takes us, wherever it goes, because we're all about basically crushing narratives. Narratives are irrelevant. What does history say? What do the facts say?
Mm-hmm.
Just felt it needed to be restated.
No, absolutely. And to me, that's one thing definitely want to reiterate. This series is definitely unbiased. We are going to look under every crook and cranny to uncover from both sides what really happened that really made these individuals take the path that they took. You know, the thing is, when a person look at history with a biased lens, you know, they will always miss out on the small details because to them those small details are irrelevant. They already have come in with conclusions and they want to make sure that the information they're utilizing is one that suits their agenda and their needs. And so that's why we're put it out there that we're going to be looking at all of the aspects of these individuals from personal accounts, from their own writing points and everything. So that way, people who are open minded, that's the key term, open minded, will be able to look at these individuals and can say, aha, I understand now why this person did what they did.
Case in point, and we're definitely going to move on. I've said it, I repeat it, and people look at me wide eyed when I say this. Adolf Hitler was not the monster. The monster was Reinhard Heydrich. Hitler wanted to remove the Jews, the German Jews, from Germany. He asked Himmler, "What do I do with them? I know no one is going to want to take 10 million Jews. I know this. What do I do?" Himmler asked one of his top generals, Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich came back a few days later, a detailed plan, the final solution to the Jewish question. Hitler read it. He approved it. Again, not absolving him of anything, but he's not the monster we've all been told he was. The monster was Reinhard Heydrich. It was his plan. And at the Swansea conference, he detailed the logistics of his plan. So,
Mm-hmm.
again, history, facts, facts.
Yep, absolutely. So next it says, it is perhaps too easy to see Mussolini as the ultimate political adventurer who was prepared to do anything to achieve power. I hope the audience caught that right there. I'm going to read it again. It is perhaps too easy to see Mussolini as the ultimate political adventurer who was prepared to do anything to achieve power.
Bingo.
Again, it's not a coincidence that you can look at people that's on the left wing and the right wing, but yet they both talk the same language. They both talk the same talking points. And unfortunately, it literally goes over the head of the masses. They just can't comprehend. Gotta love history. Gotta love history.
There are a certain supremacist and a certain pro whatever whatever are two sides of the same coin. They both want the same things. They just go about it differently. I'm gonna leave that there.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. And Ace, the book is the biography of Mussolini by Peter Neville. The link to that book is actually in the description for Barnes and Nobles. I highly recommend you get it because we're reading the same context. Next, it says certain constants did exist on his political map, certainly from 1914 to 1915 onwards. Italian greatness had to be asserted, and a move away from enfeebled democracy towards virile nationalism ensured. At the same time, Mussolini's overriding obsession with personal success remained the dominant feature of his political life.
Uh-oh.
Oh, yeah.
Copy and paste.
Yep.
Once again.
Yep. You can take Mussolini out of this story and replace him with either Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill. You still get the same type of character. Mussolini may be on the extreme end, but nevertheless, he's definitely no different from the three we just mentioned.
And that's the funny thing. I know people who were listening to our series when we first started were surprised to learn Adolf Hitler was not a monster, and he was not the extreme person that we've all been taught that he is. History says he is. No, I'm sorry. Propaganda says that he is.
Mm-hmm.
The current accepted history says that he is. But if you check his history, he wasn't. It was individuals around him doing certain things. But again, we already did a deep dive on that. So again, you can see how these men, monsters are not born, they're made. So they were each monsters in their own way, but not what was portrayed in the media, good or bad. Even Hitler, he was a monster in certain ways, but not in the ways that we've been told. But he, like the other three, they were made. They were not born.
Yep, absolutely. So next we get into, I believe this is the last section of this particular autobiography that will then lead up to the point of the early years of Mussolini, and that is Italian entry into the war. It says, despite Mussolini's efforts, most Italians were opposed to entry into the First World War until well into 1915. The Socialist Party, which had expelled Mussolini in November of 1914, remained non-interventionist, as were most political active Catholics, encouraged by Pope Benedict. Reports to the government by regional officials also showed that the public feared war which they thought would bring the country no benefits. The decision to enter ultimately owed much to political maneuvering by the country's leadership. Salandra had initially been a neutralist, like his chief parliamentary opponent, Giolitti, but he came to see the war as a means of strengthening his shaky position as national leader. It was also true that the Entente powers, Britain, France, and Russia, could make a more enticing offer to bring Italy into the war than could their opponents. On Trieste, for example, Austria-Hungary was willing merely to designate it as a free city, while also conceding the right to an Italian university. By contrast, the Entente powers would offer outright annexation of the city by Italy, plus the South Tyrol, the Trentini, Istria, and half of Dalmatia, facing Italy across the Adriatic Sea. Thus, it was that on the 26th of April, 1915, Italy signed the Treaty of London, whereby she promised to enter the war on the side of Britain and France within a month, in exchange for the above-mentioned territories. 10 days later, the Italians renounced the Triple Alliance of 1882, which bound them to Germany and Austria-Hungary. So here we see that the Italians at the time were practicing isolationism. The public, for the most part, was not interested in being involved in the war. But again, the masses will still follow suit with what the leaders feel that is best for them.
And it's funny that Salandra was basically maneuvered into getting into Salandra was maneuvered into having the country enter the war.
Mm-hmm.
And if we study through history, I've noticed that a leader who's politically weak, when he's maneuvered into war under the thinking that it's going to strengthen his position, every single time it ultimately leads to his downfall. Because everyone else realizes that he was manipulated into doing something by a rival, and it always backfires on him every single time.
Yep.
And it's funny because during the Battle of Britain, the events leading up to Dunkirk, even though Winston Churchill is probably the only, or one of the few political leaders who was politically weak, who was manipulated into doing something militarily, but it worked out for him. Generally, it does not work out for the leader of a country.
Yeah, but even in the case of Winston Churchill, despite that outcome actually, worked in his favor in regards to bringing the Americans into the war. Some would say that the Japanese were the ones that brought the Americans to the war and everything. But in actuality, the Americans were already pre-planning in some form or fashion to enter the war, at least from Franklin Roosevelt and his cabinet party. Mm-hmm. They just needed an excuse to go to a full war front. And just so happened, Pearl Harbor fell right into their laps. But the reason I say that with Winston Churchill is the empire never truly recovered after the war. They lost a lot of territory when, say, India broke off, and some of the small Pacific islands that were under political rule, like Singapore, they eventually broke off from
and they
Great
lost
Britain.
Every Caribbean nation over the next 25 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they lost every African nation.
Right.
When I say every, the four or five that were still either colonies or under some sort of control.
Exactly. So even in the case of Winston Churchill, even though it didn't cost him his position, it was still some form of repercussion to where the Britain Empire never truly recovered its world power, you can say, right after the war. So, but still,
definitely,
yeah.
Quick question, just out of curiosity, what are your thoughts on the? Because I don't. What are your thoughts on the storyline that MI6 found out about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and that they either sat on the information or they gave it to FDR, but FDR sat on it to allow it to happen, to use it as an excuse for America to enter the war? So one account says Churchill knew but withheld the information. Another report says he gave it to Roosevelt, but he sat on it. So what are your thoughts on it? Because me personally, I haven't seen enough to form a definitive opinion either way, but I find it interesting anyway.
Good sir. Oh my goodness. This is one reason why I can't wait till we kind of talk about this event and everything. But I will say this, and I will give a little hint out to the audience. There is evidence that at least 2 days before Pearl Harbor was attacked, Franklin D. Roosevelt had the coordinates of the Kido Butai heading towards Hawaii and did not say anything about it.
You know, Admiral Kimmel lost his command as commanding officer of the Pacific Fleet because of the Pearl Harbor invasion. And that's how Admiral Nimitz went down in history as one of the greatest admirals ever.
Yep.
And General Short lost his command as commander of the Army garrison stationed at Pearl Harbor. Interesting.
Yep. And in fact, it was that reason when the CIA finally declassified documents that actually showed that Franklin D. Roosevelt's cabinet did know about the eventual attack of Pearl Harbor. That was one of the reasons why back in 1995 or 96, Congress had to issue a posthumously apology to both the families of Admiral Kimmel and General Shorts. Because, go ahead.
No, please, go ahead.
I was going to say, the whole time, America just assumed that this attack on Pearl Harbor just came out of nowhere and that, so to speak, it caught America by surprise. But evidence, especially in recent years, have actually came out that the government, and especially President Roosevelt's cabinet, knew about the oncoming attack, but pretty much sat on it because they were looking for a means to enter the war. Because see, and I'll go ahead and jump the gun a little bit, but I definitely will get more in details once we kind of get more closer to those subjects later on in the series. But at the time, America as a whole was not interested in what was going on in the Eastern Front as far as Britain and Germany and you know, the World War II events going on there.
Right.
So Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his private diary, was trying to cock up a reason that would stir the masses to get more involved into World War II. Now, he was hoping, check this out, he was hoping that the Germans would do a similar incident to what they did back in World War I, where a German U-boat sank a British ocean liner that was carrying some Americans. And
the Lutzow. No, the Lusitania, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that ocean liner. They was hoping that the Germans would do something similar to that. And so that's why they would send some ocean liners directly in the path of some of the territories that the U-boats were patrolling. They were hoping that one of the Germans would slip up and attack. But, and I applaud the Germans because they were mainly focused on the Britons. They could care less as far as what the Americans was doing behind the scenes. But FDR was hoping that a similar incident like that would happen, but it never manifested. It was only when Pearl Harbor and the lead up to it that Roosevelt says this will be the event that will get us into the war.
Now, it's funny because if you study history, well, not you, because, you know, I know that you do, but for the average person, if the average person studies history, every government that has ever existed, including kings, pharaohs, whatever term they choose to use, every government will literally kill its own citizens to maintain power. Every government in history has killed its own citizens to maintain power, because the only thing that matters to them is maintaining power. That's why the elites stay the elites and the masses stay the masses. Now, At no time in history do people want to widely accept that, especially not in this day and age where we're sophisticated and we have technology and we have media and you're in the land of the free and the home of the brave. God forbid. What does it say that your own government can and will kill you to maintain power? That you sitting in your comfy home with your Wi-Fi and your PlayStation, your government can and will kill you with zero remorse to maintain power. That shakes people to their very core, that then triggers the cognitive dissonance. And then comes 1,000 other obfuscatory arguments to take you away from the fact that every government kills its own citizens to maintain power. And that includes every government that ever was on the continent of Africa. So please don't even throw that nonsense in my direction. Please. I don't want to hear it.
All right. Yep, I'm definitely in that same boat too. Like, there is no country that do not have tainted blood on their hands. In some form or fashion, they did something to their citizens to maintain control. Whether they did it through their own domestic policies or they let foreign policies get involved. So, I'll just leave it at that. We'll go ahead and continue to the next paragraph. It says Giolitti was not told about the secret Treaty of London and was furious when he found out about it. But he did not dare to challenge the decision to go to war. King Victor Emmanuel III did not even bother to consult Parliament before signing the declaration of war against the Austrians, thus demonstrating the shaky nature of Italian democracy. Neither was the behavior of the king and Salandra without precedent. Giolitti had not consulted Parliament before sanctioning the war with Libya in 1911. He also was aware of an intimidating level of right-wing street violence and thuggery orchestrated by Mussolini and the extreme nationalist poet Gabriele D'Annunzio in Milan and elsewhere. The interventionists consisted of a curious ragbag of rightists and leftists, from Marinetti's ultra-violent nationalist futurists to reformist socialists such as Bissolati and excitable young Republicans like Nenni. But they were nonetheless both noisy and effective. It was an hour of triumph for Benito Mussolini. In 1919, he was to boast that he had started a revolution in May of 1915, which was exquisitely and divinely revolutionary, because it overturned a shameful situation at home. Nevertheless, his expectations about the war proved to be woefully wide of the mark. He thought that Italy's involvement would tip the scales so that there would be a rapid Entente victory. Instead, Italy fought a bloody and largely inconclusive campaign against the Austrians from 1915 until the final sudden victory with the Anglo-French help in 1918. Mussolini also believed that Italy's economy was robust enough not to be adversely affected by the war, when in fact, it merely highlighted the country's economic deficiencies. Yet, although he did not know it, the grim attritional war into which Italy had thrust itself was to give Mussolini the opportunity he craved. So, in other words, hoping that this war would somehow get Italy into prime real estate and really, so to speak, help boost their economy, it pretty much was the opposite. It just made matters worse upon their economy.
It reminds me, first and foremost, the first thing that came to my mind was the beer hall putsch and Hitler's failed. And that was a real insurrection attempt, not this riot we saw in the Congress building. But difference is Hitler served with 2 or 3 years jail time for that, and he wrote his book Mein Kampf. But I see again, cut, copy, and paste. Hitler was wrong. He was wide of the mark. He misread the social and political situation at the time, and he paid the price for it. But he came out stronger afterwards, as did El Duce.
Yep. Just interesting, but it gets good from this point. So check this out. Next paragraph says, Mussolini later tried to pretend in his autobiography that he had volunteered to join the Italian army, saying that he had done so as soon as the war was declared. This was not the case. Mussolini expected the struggle to be short, so he remained at his editorial desk, only joining the army when the process of conscription forced him to do so.
That sounds a lot like President Baby Bush, but I digress. Oh, and President Trump, but I digress. And President Clinton, but again, I digress.
Oh yeah, there's gonna be some more Easter eggs in this. Check this out. So it then says there is nothing, however, to suggest that Mussolini was not a brave and effective soldier, although the army may have been reluctant to take him because of his record as a political subversive. He was promoted to sergeant and resented the fact that he was not offered an officer's commission, but could not so secretly resist the urge to make absurd distortions of his military record. These included, check this out, creating the myth that he had 40 grenade fragments taken from his body without anesthetics. It was true. It was true that Mussolini's grenade thrower had blown up, and that the Austrians had deliberately shelled his hospital because they knew their enemy was being treated there. This nonsense found its way into heroic fascist myth. Mussolini's distortions were echoed, interestingly, by Adolf Hitler, his future fellow dictator.
Didn't I just mention our lovely friend Adolf?
Yes, sir. Oh boy, but it's something how now even in Hitler's distortion, his was a little bit more realistic, I would say, when we read up on it. His was more on the lines of he was actually on the front lines, even though he was mainly a messenger boy. You know, he wasn't really fighting off, shooting rifles at the enemy, but indeed, right, he was on the front lines. But this man, Mussolini, it's like, dude, there is no record of you even being on the front lines.
Talk about delusions of grandeur.
Very. It says Hitler claimed to have been a frontline soldier engaged in hand-to-hand combat when in fact he was a messenger running between different positions. Like Mussolini, he was a brave enough soldier, courageous enough to receive the Iron Cross First Class, whereas Mussolini did not receive a similar award. But his role was not glamorous enough for the inaccurate version of his early life presented in the book Mein Kampf. As Hitler's acolyte, Joseph Goebbels was to write later, "Where you're going to lie, lie big." Both Hitler and Mussolini were adept at that practice. Yeah. All right. The next paragraph says Mussolini's wounds were real enough for him to be invalidated out of the Italian army in June of 1917. He then returned to his position as editor of Il Popolo d'Italia and castigated the government for poor leadership and lack of fighting spirit. At one point, it appears that Mussolini and other discontented politicians discussed the possibility of a coup d'etat with the then Army Commander-in-Chief Cardona, only for Cardona to develop cold feet about the scheme. And then we finally get to the last paragraph, or the last section. It says in March of 1917, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, was forced to abdicate, and in November, the provisional government, which had displaced him, was brought down in its turn by the Bolsheviks under the leader, Lenin. Mussolini welcomed the revolution in Russia. He had, after all, expected a war to bring about the revolution in his own country. But he was unimpressed by Lenin, whom he regarded as just a new version of Tsar Nicholas. Partly his attitude was dictated by his resentment of Russia's effective withdrawal from the war, which allowed the Austro-Hungarians to reinforce the Alpine frontier. In 1917 was also the year of the catastrophic Italian defeat at Caporetto, which part of the scenes in the early video shown in the stream talked a little bit about. In October, which coincided with the Russian Revolution, and which Mussolini blamed on the feebleness of parliamentary government in Italy, socialist anti-war propaganda, and poor leadership. Never, Mussolini later wrote, have I experienced a sorrow equal to that which I suffered after news of the defeat of Caporetto. This feeling was probably genuine enough, even if Mussolini looked to the wrong quarters for an explanation. Enthusiasm for the war was much weaker in the army than he liked to pretend. Cardona blamed the defeat at Caporetto on cowardice and had thousands of soldiers executed. So again, as we clearly see, the Italians pretty much government is just going down the drain, and essentially the propaganda that is trying to show Italy doing some damage in the war is actually having the opposite effect. They're the ones taking on a lot of damage.
This, again, cut, copy, paste. Germany after the end of World War One. Adolf Hitler comes back home to a country torn in half, devastated, economically crushed. People are burning the money to use to warm their homes. Nationalism starts to take hold. Soldiers are coming home and burning their uniforms. The Kriegsmarine, or was the Navy at that time was not called the Kriegsmarine. Same thing, burning their uniforms. Goering comes home. He's disgusted by the Kaiser. He gets one of his planes and flies away and leaves Germany. A convenient fact which is left out of the history books, by the way, but I digress. So, again, cut, copy, paste. You see how both of these countries were devastated and in total shambles and, ripe for the plucking by the vultures. And it took someone, a strong, charismatic leader, to rally the people and turn things around.
Yep.
Again, we can have the moral arguments in a different venue. We're just looking at the facts and separating the facts from what we've all been told to be facts.
Yep, absolutely. Next it says, Mussolini's position had become more and more authoritarian as the war entered its decisive phase in 1918. He was convinced by now that parliamentary government must be swept away and replaced by some form of dictatorship. It was true that in some respects, Mussolini was a true prophet, who was not far wrong in declaring that democracy had been killed during the war. He was certainly astute enough to see that the end of the war, which would bring with it the demobilization of hundreds of thousands of disillusioned Army veterans, would offer opportunities to right-wing nationalists like himself. Mussolini had begun to talk about Trencherocrazia, or government by the trenches, as early as 1916, as he sensed that his fellow soldiers would not be content with the corrupt geolitism of pre-war days. The common experience of death and privation in the trenches would, Mussolini believed, cut across party political boundaries in setting up expectations about a new, more dynamic post-war Italy. The war ended with dramatic suddenness in the autumn of 1918, with the decisive event on the Italian front being the shattering Austro-Hungarian defeat at Vittorio Veneto in October, or Veneto. The victory was achieved only with the Anglo-French assistance, which had been made available to the Italians after the disaster at Caporetto a year earlier. But this did not dent Mussolini's capacity for hyperbole. Vittorio Veneto was described by him as the greatest victory in world history when, in fact, the decisive struggle was between the Germans and the Anglo-French in the West. Nevertheless, it appeared to provide Italy with the opportunity for territorial aggrandizement, which Mussolini had been demanding since 1915. The Adriatic and the Mediterranean were now to become Italian seas. His newspaper dropped any last pretensions to be socialist. Or, excuse me, I read that back. The Adriatic and the Mediterranean were now to become Italian seas, and Italy the dominant Mediterranean power. At the same time, his newspaper dropped any last pretensions to be socialist. Mussolini had, after all, been expelled from the Italian Socialist Party 4 years before, and was presumably only preserving the illusion of socialist leanings to strengthen his credentials with the working class. Mussolini's rejection of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 peace points, with their commitment to self-determination in Central and Eastern Europe, showed how far the young politician and journalist had moved away from the socialist position. The war assisted Mussolini in two ways. First, the Italian economy, weak as it was compared with Italy's Anglo-French allies, was more affected by post-war inflation and unemployment. And second, the war brought about a polarization of Italian politics between the patriotic right and the left. Mussolini and his supporters were able to demonize the left for being unpatriotic, and he also soon realized the potential of anti-Bolshevik propaganda, which focused on the threat to Italian life from Russian-inspired communism. Landowners, industrialists, and Catholics alike were petrified by the threat from communism in post-war Italy, even though the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, did not actually come into existence until 1921. This fear was partly a result of socialist revolutionary rhetoric, which frightened the middle classes and forced them to look to the right for a savior.
Bingo! Left wing, right wing, it's all the same bird.
All the same bird. And again, history repeating itself. See, the audience, what I want y'all to do, whenever y'all get a chance, I want y'all to look at the 2016 election and the process leading up to the 2016. And you know what? I'll even throw a bone out there. Look at the last presidential election, the 2020 election. And I want y'all to look at each of the propaganda that was really spewing in those elections. But particularly, I want to really hone in on the 2016. And the reason being is because you and I both know that in 2016, there was a scare that if Hillary was to become the first lady of the White House, the first female president, that there would be some political unrest and potential war. And I don't know about you, but I could definitely say there were some people that I heard of that were saying that if Hillary was elected president, World War III was just around the corner.
But
And I'm laughing. I'm laughing now because it's like funny how it takes a national scare to drive the masses to a certain political standpoint. And even last year's political election,
mhm.
the same trick was played on the masses.
There you go. Bingo. Bingo. Touchdown. Now here comes the 2 point conversion. We're going for 8 points on this one.
Mmm.
Here's what people need to understand. Left wing, right wing, it's all the same bird. Anything that a politician says, dismiss it out of hand because it's lies. And even when they tell the truth, it's a truth sandwiched between two lies. That's how they work. There is no left, there is no right, there is no Republican, there is no Democrat. That's all public theater. You are supposed to think that. So therefore, you run around like a rat chasing its tail through a maze, thinking that there is a difference when there isn't. When there isn't. It's all a game. It's Pavlovian responses. You are exhibiting Pavlov and his experiment every single day, every single time. This is all a game. It's all been predetermined and it has all been pre-planned. If you check the history, there's so much history and precedent to show you. It should be instructive to you. All of these things that you're arguing about, it's bread and circuses because it's all a game. Left or right, that's for the masses. As Brother Sigmund Jones says all the time, the elites practice classism while the masses practice racism and they chase their tails. So all these arguments about Republicans and conservatives and liberals and all of those discussions are to keep you distracted from following the money to see where the real control is and where things are being run from and how they're being orchestrated for you. All of it. Even that riot, that little small, and that's all that was, that small little uncontrolled riot. It's all pre-planned and pre-packaged.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And, oh, go ahead.
no, please.
Well,
Go right ahead.
I really wanted to highlight exactly what you're talking about. And the reason why I say that the elites practice classism and everybody else practice racism, sexism, feminism, all the other isms, whereas the elites only practice one. And I'm going to show you why. When Paul talks about follow the money, not only does he mean that literally in regards to who's funding who in regards to these agendas and whatnot, but also he's metaphorically telling you, look at what the people who are funding these agendas and whatnot, look what kind of life they live. And so I'm going to drop a little secret. The elites who practice classism, what you'll find is they're not extreme on the left,
Nope.
nor are they extreme on the right.
There you go.
They are perfectly in the middle, which I find it hilarious when I hear people talk about how, oh, the elites are trying to push such and such agenda upon us and everything. And I'm thinking to myself, well, do you realize that the elites are not practicing what they're preaching? That should have been a red flag right there.
Yep, it should be, but people don't, listen, to further drive this point home, Donald J. Trump is not a racist. He is not an idiot. That's playing to a base. That is also playing the part for cabinet members and people around him. Like every president since LBJ, he himself is also a puppet of the controlling elite. Even with his money, even with his billions and being a businessman, and no, he is not broke, because I have detailed how what that tax return proves, that he's playing the same game as every other wealthy person. You only show a certain amount of assets directly in your name on paper, and you take losses every year to offset taxes. That's how that game is played on that level. But the masses do not understand that. So they're running around with 25-hour live streams saying, yeah, see, he's broke. Ha, 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 ha. No, the joke is on you because you don't understand how the game works. So Paulie is laughing at you. Ha, 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 ha. Now, if you look at his history, Donald J. Trump is far from racist. Far from racist.
Mm-hmm.
Playing to a base, which is why, like a lot of wealthy Democrats, lifelong, when they run for office, they switch to Republican.
Mm-hmm.
So they play to who? To their base. So they say things like, grab them by the box. Or they say things like, I can kill someone in the middle of Times Square at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and still get elected. Why they can say things like, I love the poor and the uneducated. Because that's the base. This is how politics actually works. It's not about issues and policies and and statecraft. No. Let me back up. That is statecraft. Politics is manipulating the masses into thinking and believing what's presented to them in front of their face.
Mm-hmm.
That's politics. So that's playing to a base. So now you think that he's racist, and people who are follow him. People who think that he's a conservative, they follow him. Regardless of everything he's done in his life proves that he's not a racist and he's not a conservative, you believe that. So he says things to play it to the base to maintain this image, and you believe this. That's what politics is. Much different from statecraft.
Yep.
But again, if you're too stuck in your narratives, you don't want to take an objective view and research these things and understand these things. There's a reason why I keep saying you have to elevate your thinking. But most people lack the ability or the desire to actually elevate their thinking. They only want to look at things that reinforce their narrative. You don't learn if you exist in an echo chamber.
Yep.
Like a certain sphere, but I digress.
Indeed, sir. Indeed. All right. The next paragraph says, the impact of the war in Italy needs emphasizing. Italy lost 5.1% of the working male population, although this compared favorably with the 10.5% lost by France and the 11.1% of Germans of military age killed. As has been seen, this devastating human loss was combined with the inflationary pressures, which in turn forced up unemployment. This helped to create the pool of disillusioned, which created recruits for Mussolini, even if Italian unemployment rates were not as high as those in Britain and Germany. But the genesis of the far right goes back to before 1914. Corradini's El Regno, 1903, provided the writers with an influential journal, and increasing dissatisfaction with Giolitti-style democracy brought about the formation of the Italian Nationalist Association in 1910. This right-wing nationalism was anti-democratic, elitist, and imperialistic, stances that Mussolini himself had adopted long before December of 1917, when he wrote in Il Popolo d'Italia of his belief in an anti-Marxist and national socialism. Nevertheless, the pool of unemployed ex-soldiers and the rise in living costs, together with a lack of faith in Italy's democratic institutions, provided Mussolini and the nationalist right with a favorable post-war environment, especially as the socialists too poured scorn on the existing Italian governmental system. Next, it says opponents of the existing system, such as Mussolini, were further encouraged by the failure of the new Prime Minister Orlando to secure the sort of territorial gains most Italians wanted. Orlando cut a poor figure in comparison with the other Allied leaders, Wilson, Lloyd George, and Clemenceau. Newspapers may have spoken of the Big Four, but the weakness of Italy's position became painfully obvious at the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference. President Woodrow Wilson, who believed that secret diplomacy had helped to cause the war, would not abide by all the terms of the Treaty of London, and the French also opposed cessions of territory by the newly established Yugoslav state. This meant that Italian demands for Trieste and Dalmatia would not be honored. Neither was Italy invited to participate in the carving up of Turkey's Middle Eastern Empire, which fell into Anglo-French hands, albeit organized under the League of Nations mandate system. Orlando returned to Italy in disgrace, and D'Annunzio talked of Vittoria Mutilata, or mutilated victory. Most Italians felt that they had been cheated by their allies. It's funny how not only the Italians, but the Germans, even though the Germans was on the losing side, both of these countries truly believed that they were cheated out of the war.
And they were. If you look at the terms of surrender both countries had to sign, and the economic impositions that both countries were forced to accept and kowtow to, they were clearly taken advantage of. But what can you do? You just lost a war. You don't have a leg to stand on.
Yep. Indeed. So next it says, this was fertile territory for Mussolini. But in the short term, he was upstaged by Gabriele D'Annunzio. In September of 1919, it was the colorful poet who, together with mutinous units in the Italian army, seized Fiume from the Yugoslavs. Mussolini had apparently spoken to D'Annunzio about such a coup beforehand. D'Annunzio also wrote to Mussolini, according to his version of events, saying, "The dice are on the table. Tomorrow I shall take Fiume with force of arms. The God of Italy assists us." But the harmony between the two men described in Mussolini's autobiography is misleading. Mussolini was undoubtedly alarmed that his fellow nationalists had stolen a march on him. Neither did he go and join D'Annunzio in Fiume, with the consequence that the latter called him a coward. In reality, Mussolini was in a difficult position. He had to support D'Annunzio's annexation of the city, but he did not want to be associated with the failure. In fact, Fiume had not even been mentioned in 1915 in the Treaty of London, so its seizure was totally unjustified. Italian nationalists justified it by saying that there was a majority of Italians in Trieste and its hinterland. But because D'Annunzio's coup was so popular in Italy, Prime Minister Nitti dared not to expel D'Annunzio by force. In November of 1920, a compromise was reached under the terms of the Treaty of Rapallo, whereby Fiume was to become independent. Not Italian, but not Yugoslav either. The rebel leader obstinately refused to surrender the city, even though, by then, most people had got bored with D'Annunzio. On Christmas Day in 1920, Giolitti, Prime Minister yet again, had to send in the Italian Navy to force him into doing so. The Fiume episode highlighted the weakness of the Italian state and the popularity, however transient, of dramatic nationalist coups. It was also a seminal event for Mussolini and the fascist movement which he had set up in March of 1919. Many of the artifacts of Italian fascism first appeared in Fiume with D'Annunzio and his supporters. Thus, the uniforms and the black shirts, originally worn by the Arditi, or shock troops in World War I, the Roman salute, the oceanic rallies, were plagiarized from D'Annunzio. But Mussolini would ensure that D'Annunzio, a famous aviator and poet in his own right, had never get the chance to upstage him again. D'Annunzio had an international reputation, was a war hero who had led a daring aerial raid on Vienna in 1918, and was, according to Mussolini's latest biographer, a more credible national leader. Talk about a jab. He was therefore a real threat to Mussolini, who regarded him with wary respect. The claim in fascist propaganda after 1922 that the two men had collaborated over the Fiume occupation was nonsense, however. There is an important sense in which Mussolini's own fascism was derivative. D'Annunzio prepared the way for him in 1919 at Fiume. Indeed, Mussolini appeared to recognize this when he later encouraged the publication of a biography of D'Annunzio, which took at its title The John the Baptist of Fascism, leaving Mussolini, of course, as a Christ-like figure in the history of fascism. Propaganda. And what's interesting is even today, some 80 years after the fact, you still have people who believe in fascism, and they will tell you that Gabriele D'Annunzio was John the Baptist, and he led the way for Benito Mussolini. That's what I find interesting.
Again, the facts are there. People have to go read and research, but people don't want to read. So, there you go.
Yep, there you go. It then says, once in power, Mussolini was wary of D'Annunzio, who was kept under what amounted to house arrest. Historians have speculated on what might have happened had D'Annunzio tried to seize power himself in Rome in 1919. Some even encouraged him to do so. He himself certainly castigated Mussolini, accusing him of trembling with fear at the time of the Fiume occupation and skulking in Milan. D'Annunzio himself had been accused of living under a fragile glitz, while remaining the incarnation of sensuality and self-indulgence. Rapid sexual misbehavior was certainly a characteristic of occupation of Fiume. It was also typical of Mussolini, but he had the edge over D'Annunzio when it came to ruthless decisiveness. He would do the aging poet favors, especially in his early days in power after 1922. But as the years passed, Mussolini treated D'Annunzio with increasing contempt. Gabriele D'Annunzio died on the 1st of March, 1938. Mussolini is alleged to have remarked, "At last," on hearing the news. Ever the showman, like D'Annunzio, Mussolini insisted on being the chief mourner at the funeral.
That's politics. It's a popularity contest. It's all about the image. That's all that matters. It doesn't matter what you do or what you say. It's all about the image. If you give people a bunch of empty promises, but you say it in a nice, charismatic way, they will follow you through the gates of hell, even though they're the only ones wearing gasoline underwear. But I digress.
You're right about that. I just find it interesting that, like you pointed out, politics is nothing but theater on a more nationalistic stage.
Yep.
You have people who will definitely put on a great show. I mean, don't get me wrong. I just so happened to listen in on the second impeachment that was going on this week. And I'm listening to how these politicians, both left and right, coming in and giving their utmost best assertion about why the president needs to be impeached, why he shouldn't be impeached, how this is a national threat, how this would cause civil war. And I'm listening in and I'm thinking to myself, my God, the sad part about this, there is somebody on the other end of this tube that literally believes every single thing they are hearing. That's the scary part.
Well, the fact is, I would say most people. Most people. See, here's my take on it. President Trump is out of office in 4 more days.
Mm-hmm.
Why bother? Why bother to remove him from office now? He's got 4 more days in office. He's gone anyway. Impeach him for what? For what purpose? Besides, you're not going to remove him from office the same way he wasn't going to be removed the first time he was impeached. The same way William Jefferson Clinton was not impeached. People hear that word and they don't even know how their own government works. The president has to be impeached in both houses of Congress. Then and only then can you begin the process to remove that president from office.
Mm-hmm.
Several presidents have been impeached in one house of Congress. It's meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
Especially since politics is all a popularity contest. It doesn't matter. Because the people who support that president, they don't care what you have to say about their president. So, here what you saw was political grandstanding theater at its finest. And people talking left, front, and center with all kind of ideals and covering this thing as if it even really matters. Here's the thing, as if it even really matters. You have a new president in 4 days. President Kamala, I'm sorry, President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris. So, what difference does it make? But again, it's easier to fool a man than it is to convince him that he has in fact been fooled. So, I scratch my head when I see people say things like, well, people think about Biden and Biden's history and what is Kamala Harris going to do for us and what is Biden going to do for us? Riddle me this, Batman. If the Republican Party has proven they don't need you for anything to elect candidates, from president down to local dog catcher, the Republican Party literally needs you for absolutely nothing. Every person on the face of this blue little planet knows that many people blindly support the Democratic Party, no matter what they say, filling them up with empty promises that they never deliver on. So where exactly is your political power? Riddle me that. Then, after you riddle me that, going back to if you're paying attention, America is ruled by the controlling elite. Left wing, right wing, it doesn't matter. It's all the same bird. So nothing has changed. So now, if you tell me that Donald J. Trump is a threat to national security, so let me ask you this. I'm guessing Barack Hussein Obama was not a threat to national security when he increased the amount of troops sent over to the Middle East region? The Arab region? I'm guessing Baby Bush was not a threat to national security when he said you're either with this or against this. when he said we're going to go in there in every foxhole and smoke him out and kill every last one of them some bitches. When he said that on national TV, I guess he was not a threat to national security. I guess William Jefferson Clinton was not a threat to national security when he sent troops to Somalia and Ethiopia. When he fought a war in Kosovo just to hide the fact, to cover up, to distract from the fact of yet another sex scandal. I guess Bush Sr. was not a national security threat when he sent us to the first Gulf War. Or I'm guessing President Reagan wasn't a threat to national security when he talked about Star Wars and wanting to fight nuclear war with Russia. But hey, what do I know? But all of a sudden, with 4 days left in office, Donald J. Trump is the Antichrist. Okay. Bringing us back to what we talked about at the top of this evening's stream. He who controls the dissemination of information controls the masses. All you have to do is say something and say it with conviction. People will take it as gospel truth. Doesn't matter how wrong it is. It does not withstand critical thinking. And even if I sit someone down and you explain this to them, they're going to say, well, all I know is Kamala ain't for us. You're totally lost the plot. If that's all you have to say, you've totally lost the plot.
Yep. Well, before we conclude tonight's episode of the early years of Il Duce, the Iron Prefect, aka Benito Mussolini, sir, what are your departing thoughts up to this point in the series in regards to Mussolini's early life, his influence, or the people that influenced him up until this point, and the fact that he started off a staunch left-wing enthusiast and was really all about revolution and power to the people, to suddenly, within a matter of probably a year and a half, he's a staunch right-wing nationalist.
So, being born into wealth, Winston Churchill, being born into modest means, El Duce and Lenin, and being born dirt poor, Adolf Hitler, all four men, other than what they were born into, led exactly the same life, exactly the same upbringing, exactly the same father, exactly the same path through life, losing a mother young, losing a father young, didn't get along with the father, wanted to go into the seminary, wanted to go into art, went into journalism, went into politics, very undistinguished career in the military, little to no success with women except maybe one or two, on the left, on the right, in the middle, taking power, manipulating power, consistently. Cut, copy, paste. It is amazing. It never ceases to amaze me how for these men, it's almost as if the fates, as they were weaving their tapestry, designed it that these four men were going to end up where they were. Amazing. So, with all of that said, it is amazing. As I've said, a handful of men changed the course of this planet forever. A group of maybe 20 men. That's it. But those men put themselves into positions where their decisions rippled out and moved mountains. So if you really want to understand what happened during World War II, you look at these men who were involved, who became these leaders, and where they came from, how they were created. They were not born monsters, but they were certainly made that way.
Mm-hmm.
And the life lessons that repeat themselves through history and are still repeating themselves now. And if you really study, as I learned in school, if you want to know where things are headed, all you have to do is look to where you came from. And that has held true for centuries, and it is still true today.
Exactly.
And that's all I got.
Exactly. Very spot on. And that's another thing too. I also want to point out. Now, I know people will talk about, well, the information that's out there, especially when it comes to history and whatnot. All you got to do is just Google search, and the information is there. Well, let me tell you this. That is only half true. And the reason why I say that is only half true is because, yes, there's a lot of information that's out there on Google in regards to history and what information you want to look for. But I can tell you this much. You probably are not going to find all the information you're looking for. Like I mentioned last on the last episode we did of Mussolini, there was not much information out there about Mussolini's early life. Sure, there was Wikipedia, but the thing about Wikipedia is you can have people come through and input their own information, which to
Yeah,
me,
yeah. Wikipedia should not be taken as a source of good information unless you want something quick on fluff, comic books, film, celebrities, something like that. But serious information, Wikipedia is the last place you ever want to look.
exactly. And so for me, my belief was, well, hey, yes, you can find information on Google, but if you want to do some real research, get your nose in the book. And this is why I chose the book by Peter Neville on the biography of Mussolini, because it touches on details that you're not going to be able to find on Google. And to me, I have this sense that there's a reason why some historical aspects of Mussolini is not made readily available for the public to view, which
Mm,
to me, I look at it as another form of biased history.
yep.
So, in other words, yeah, we'll have some information about Mussolini, but if you want to know more, you're going to have to do your own research, and you're going to have to do it outside of Google and the internet, which for me, that's no problem. Before the internet really blew up, I love going to the library and reading up books on these World War II figureheads and even watching videos of documentaries talking about VHS, not DVDs and whatnot, but VHS, and when talking about these particular leaders. And so for me, doing that research and really studying these figureheads, this is also why for me it doesn't matter who was wrong, who was right. In my personal opinion, I came to respect virtually a lot of them. And the reason being is because I'm able to look at their background, read up on their background, and I may not agree with everything they do. I will say that. But there's a part of me that can now look at them from a more humanistic standpoint, I would say.
Mm,
And again, you're not going to be able to do that just by searching on Google. You have to get your nose in the books.
absolutely. I couldn't agree more, and I could not have said it any better. I can't add anything to it, so I just won't.
All right. Well, with that being said, I will say that coming up, our next World War II figurehead, who's one of the leaders, will actually be none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So we're
Oh,
going to dive into his background to see how he was brought up. But I will say this, just don't be surprised if you see another copy and paste.
that's funny. He's actually from where he grew up is a 10 minute drive from where I grew up.
Wow, that's interesting.
And yep, he's right he's right on the border between New York City and right on the border between New York City and Long Island. Or at least, you know what? Let me say this. where the family home is. I'll say that, where the family
Mm.
home is, because I don't know that he necessarily how much of his childhood he spent at that particular home, but one of the homes that he lived in was 10 minutes from where I grew up.
Wow, that is interesting. Well, definitely we will be learning more about his background and some of the influence of his life in regards to what made him become his political views, especially since he was a staunch Democrat, although he too had some right wing thinking, which, like I said, politics doesn't matter if they're left wing or right wing, they're all the same bird and they all speak the same talking points. So it's going to be interesting reading up on the influence on his life growing up.
The thing that gets me is that how many people call themselves talking about politics, and I scratch my head like, you just don't get it. You've lost the plot. You're clueless. You are exhibiting Pavlovian responses. I know every word that's about to come out of your mouth before you say it. And that shouldn't be the case. But you are playing the game to a T. You are the little pawn being moved around on the chessboard. And it's funny how you call yourself a thinking person, and you're not. You're reacting to pre-programmed stimulus, stimuli. But again, it's easier to fool a person than it is to convince them that they have, in fact, been fooled. And if you want to get a person upset and get them emotional, tell them exactly what I just said.
Yeah. You know, it's funny you mention. I have heard from an individual who I will not name, but I have heard from an individual who said that the recent presidential election and the fraud, supposed fraud, and I'm putting up my fingers,
Right.
supposed fraud that happened is reminiscent of Hitler's rise to power.
What?
And when I heard that,
What?
a part of me
Wow.
kind of died because that told me right then and there, I'm sorry, but that individual does not have a clue about World War II.
Not one clue at all.
I'm just going to be honest. The supposed voter fraud, even if it did happen, that's definitely is not how the Nazis rose to power. Most
No.
certainly, that's not how.
We covered that at we covered that in the first two streams in this
Mm-hmm.
series.
Mm-hmm.
No, no. In fact, not only did we cover that in the first two streams of this series, as you and I both have said, cut, copy, and paste. You see the same situation and the same circumstances that gave rise to the nationalism and socialism that allowed that to happen in Germany and in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
The person who told you that has totally lost the plot. But see, again, as have most people, and I look at the things that they say, you've lost the plot. It's like I'm at the point now. It's like, you know what? I don't even bother even having a conversation, much less correcting them, because they're just going to repeat the same things that they've been pre-programmed to. A real-life human version of the Pavlov experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Indeed. So, with that being stated, I am Sigma Jones. This is my co-host Logic Finest, Mr. Paul. And again, if anything, for the audience that's listening in and will be listening on the replay, go and do your own research. And don't just research from one side of the story. Also get the other side of the story too. And then you will understand why these individuals did what they did, they thought the way they thought. And if you're open minded, you too will even have some humanistic approach to a lot of these leaders. and understand that, like Paul righteously said before, these monsters were not born, they were made. And believe me, even the ones who end up as the winners of this major world event in World War II, they most certainly wasn't angels even afterwards.
I'd like to say this one thing. Aizen-sama, appreciate you for coming through, but understand something. There are not two old nutty broads as leaders of the state. The leaders of the state are literally behind closed doors. You don't know their names. In fact, you may have heard their names mentioned in other areas outside of politics. That's who's really running America. No one who you see on TV in D.C. who was elected are running the country. And if you don't understand that, you need to understand that first off.
Well,
It's all public theater.
Yep. As
The
we
Koch brothers have more control over what happens in America than any of those elected people in Washington, D.C. Okay? So, as far as I'll go down that rabbit hole.
Alrighty. Well, with that being stated, I am Sigma Jones. This is Logic Finest, our co-host, Mr. Paul, and we will end with our outro to kind of reminisce it that this is indeed the War Room. Until next time.